I've made this case, and Terence made this case, the
Right.
whole stoned ape theory, which was vilified when it came out. But actually, the evidence now is even stronger that we probably did. They shared the environment with hominids as they evolved in
Hmm.
Africa and that sort of thing. That had to have had an influence on the evolution of consciousness. That's a whole other discussion. The point is that this process plays out over much longer time frames than cultural processes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the last 2 decades or so has been amazing. It's a nanosecond in the
Yeah.
actual pageantry or time frame timeline of our involvement with psychedelics.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. As you're probably aware, to at least some extent, serious progress is being made when it comes to quote unquote mainstreaming non ordinary states of consciousness. We are orienting, contextualizing, decriminalizing, medicalizing, and to a large extent, I think most of that is great. But I have to admit, when I think back to some of my own non ordinary states of consciousness, they're anything but mainstream. They're anything but normal. The high weirdness is real, my friends, and it cannot be overstated. And frankly, one wonders what the collective psychological impact on humankind will be when such experiences do become widely available. And I won't speculate on what I think some of those impacts may be in this introduction, but I will say, I think mainstreaming probably is not the right word. Destigmatizing, sacralizing, understanding, respecting, these are words I can get down with. And to say our guest in this one, Dr. Terence Mckenna, has precious nuance to add to that statement, well, that would be a true understatement. This man is an ethnopharmacologist who has spent his life, decades and decades, studying and consuming mind-altering molecules and plants. He not only has unique scientific expertise on them, but really valuable philosophical and cultural insight. Insight that extends to the non-ordinary states themselves and the phenomena that takes place in those states, but really in all of the related psychedelic milieu. Dennis is also the author of Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss, My Life with Terence Mckenna, who, if it wasn't obvious from their shared surname, was Dennis's late brother. Dennis is also doing really important conservation and educational work via his academy, the McKenna Academy. Links to that and everything that Dr. Terence Mckenna is up to is in the description. Same with Third Eye Drops. On that note, do presently tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is deeply appreciated and important for the health and growth of this media vessel. Also, did you know we've got 300 plus audio only podcasts that will never be published here on YouTube? In fact, I've got some with Terence Mckenna. You can hear them and hundreds more now on Apple Pod, Spotify, wherever you listen. Do subscribe and review there. And if you want to probe deeper into these topics, if you want to riff with me and hundreds of other Wonder Dippers and support the show, join up over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server. We've got patron-only Zoom hangs. In fact, we just did one with one of your favorite guests, my Wonder Brother, Eric Godsey. It was a 2-hour brain melter of an affair, my favorite patron call ever, and we've got more stuff like this with guests you've heard on the show coming up, and you get physical rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, all at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with the legendary Dr. Terence Mckenna. As I was saying, and you were saying, we find ourselves in strange times, particularly in this culture that you've been a part of for decades and decades. And I've been hovering around for well over a decade now, and it's not just seeing psychedelics talked about more in the media. It's not just potential legislation. It really is this mainstreaming, the likes of which I did not think that I would see, at least not this quickly. And it really did come to a head at this psychedelic science conference that MAPS put on, with the scale of it, the amount of people involved, the amount of money there. You and I were both there, and you were beginning to reflect on your thoughts on that when we were recording before in our our
Right,
ill-fated
right.
little attempt there. So if you wouldn't mind rehashing that a little bit, because it is really a nice springboard.
So, yeah, we were talking about the rapid emergence of this, the cliche is the
Hmm.
psychedelic renaissance, and an event like MAPS 2023 is kind of a marker in the
Yeah,
sense that, in the same way that MAPS 2017 was. I mean, MAPS 2017 was an impressive conference, and everybody was saying, oh, this is the psychedelic renaissance, and it's all happening. And that was true, but it was like, we ain't seen nothing yet,
right.
Now it's gone to a whole other level, and and there's reason to be encouraged by this. I mean, in the fact that, uh, as we were discussing, if you look back 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, whatever, these things were prohibited and marginalized and basically, forbidden for the mainstream. I don't know that the psychedelic movement, the psychedelic, resurgence is the mainstream. Maybe not yet, but it's getting there. And with the power of social media, that accelerates the process, in both good and bad ways. I mean, the social media is a classic example of technology that can be, misused in numerous ways, obviously, but used in very creative and productive ways as well as a means of education and so on. This is what, I mean, in a sense, this is kind of obvious that,
Yeah,
it's social media which facilitates this rapid propagation of ideas, and the sort of, changing perspectives about psychedelics. Unfortunately, I mean, the problem with social media is there's no filter on the quality of information.
no, that's
So
for
there's
sure.
a lot of crap out there, and in there's also a lot of good stuff,
Yeah,
and the psychedelic uh, community, which is burgeoning over the world, is not immune to that. There's a lot of, stupid stuff going on and being said, and a lot of, very good stuff. Uh, and I think this is just the nature of social movements, and it's kind of the nature of humans,
yeah,
and I think that, in general, the trend is encouraging.
yeah,
Many more people are being sort of woken up to, uh, the potential, the transformative power of these medicines,
yeah,
and that's a good thing. I mean, for all sorts of reasons. I've often said that these things are can be thought of as medicines for the soul, and our soul collectively is deeply wounded, and the soul of individuals is deeply wounded. I don't think you can live in this culture without
yeah,
being traumatized. And these substances are potentially a balm for that, a way to find that healing. And even on the evolutionary or biospheric level, they can be medicines for healing the planet, and our relationship to it.
yeah,
I think that big part of our challenge, a big part of our problem, our the challenge that we're facing is stems from a profound dissociation from nature,
Oh yeah.
and a
Hmm.
misunderstanding of our relationship with nature. It comes really out of the Western sort of capitalist predatory perspective that we own nature,
Right.
and nature is teaching us every day that we don't own nature. You
Yes.
only have to look at climate change and catastrophic events taking place across the world. These are not, these are natural processes, but we are making them worse, and we are an influence on that. But I think nature's sending us the message, to the primates, to the crazy monkeys, that we have to wake up, so
For
they are a
sure.
wake up call. The question is, are we listening? And
Yeah.
are enough people listening? And I guess what's encouraging about the psychedelic, emergence or revolution or renaissance, if you want to call it that, is that more and more people are listening.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah. I want to dig into a number of those things you mentioned, but yeah, that aspect of being part of this sick society, of carrying around what I've called, and I'm sure I'm not the one that coined this phrase, but I often call it soul sickness, sort of in the spirit of Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and it definitely harmonizes a lot about with a lot of things Terence used to talk about in terms of the dominator culture and things of that nature. But before we get
Right.
off the topic of the burgeoning psychedelic renaissance or mainstreaming, one of the things that struck me walking around that conference where there's clearly so many competing interests. You have a lot of the people who are artists, you have a lot of people who have been in that space for decades and decades. You have a lot of people looking to make a buck. You have a lot of people who are sort of speculating uh, in a capitalistic way. You have a lot of people who have just heard about it. They like read Michael Pollan's book, so they've never even had an experience, and they're thinking about maybe having an experience. So there's so much this weird mixture of energy, and for the most part, I completely share your thoughts that it's kind of a mixed bag, but overall, I'm very happy it's happening. But one of the things that struck me about it, walking around there, is just how divorced a really well organized, uh, huge conference like that is. The disconnection between that and the unbelievably alien like heart of the psychedelic experience. Like in some ways they couldn't be more different. Like the depths of the very experience that this conference is a purveyor of, is carrying within its belly, couldn't in a lot of ways couldn't be more different than being in this well organized space where everything's on a very specific timetable and in a specific room, and it's just, I don't know, it's just kind of a funny juxtaposition.
No, it definitely is. And I think that part of this is it's the nature of social interaction and social events in the 21st century. I think the injection of capitalism into this psychedelic process is a big influence. I mean, capitalism can co-opt anything,
Yeah.
and we think of psychedelics as kind of a spiritual tradition, or a connection back to that. But if you look back in history, like church history, for example, spirituality has always been commercialized in some ways. The granting of indulgences by the church. You could sin as much as you want as long as you paid your dues to the parish.
Mhm.
This idea, and capitalism, kind of comes with this very aggressive approach to it, and tries to take it over, and I think, and because capitalism itself and the idea of material gain and all this is so seductive, it's in part, uh, at least in part, it's successful. I don't think that it can really dominate the psychedelic, the cultural psychedelic experience, but it can have a big influence on it. I mean, there are lots of people who are predatory capitalists, who are people, you'd probably cross the street to avoid, and they're big voices in this,
Yeah.
and that's disturbing because any, not everyone who is into psychedelics and a major figure in the psychedelic realm is a bodhisattva,
No.
or even a good person.
Right.
I mean, I'd like to think I'm not a bad person. I'm one of the good people, but and I don't have, I'm not invested. At least I hope I'm not invested in personally getting rich off this. I mean, if that was my goal, I've failed miserably, you know, and that's fine. Uh, but there are lots of people who are, tremendously successful in different areas, like politics, like technology, like, and now they've discovered psychedelics, like that's
Yeah.
the next shiny object, and that's the
Yes.
thing that they want to co-opt and control. And so, when you get people like Peter Thiel involved, or I don't respect that man. I feel that he has a moral, he doesn't operate out of a moral compass. To a certain extent, I suppose I'll get a lot of flack for saying this, but I've been sort of dismayed at the transformation that Joe Rogan has gone through over the last few years.
Mm.
I mean, he used to be, I think, a much more genuine person, and now he's become like a demagogue, and it's unfortunate because these people, far more than you or me are. They have a huge platform. They influence millions and millions of people, so they have to be very mindful of the message that they're putting out there. And I think often what is there, mindfulness is not something that social media does well.
No.
Social
No.
media, it thrives on the provocative statement, or the declaration that people will make that's going to get other people riled up in some ways. We see this as it's basically destroying our politics and our democracy and all of those things that we used to, think of as so solid, and actually are extremely valuable, vulnerable, and psychedelics are threatened by this. I think the purity of them. I think that you know I've always said that I view our relationship with psychedelics from a coevolutionary perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. I think that in some ways this may just be a glitch or a moment in our long relationship with psychedelics, and as something that we, as a symbiosis, if you will,
Hmm.
as we participate in psychedelics in these relationships. I'm thinking particularly of mushrooms. You can make the case that that relationship has gone, stretches back potentially millions of years,
Yeah.
and I've made this case, and Terence made this case, the
Right.
whole stoned ape theory, which was vilified when it came out. But actually, the evidence now is even stronger that we probably did, that they shared the environment with hominids as they evolved in
Hmm.
Africa and that sort of thing. That had
What?
to have had an influence on the evolution of consciousness. That's a
Yeah.
whole other discussion. but I guess in this context, the point is that this process uh, plays out over much longer time frames than cultural processes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the last 2 decades or so has been amazing. It's a very, very tiny. Uh, it's a nanosecond in the
Yeah.
actual pageantry or time frame timeline of our involvement with psychedelics,
Yeah.
which will stretch
Yeah.
into the future if we have a future. There is a question
Yeah.
about
Right. Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So much to think about there, but the thing that keeps rattling around my psyche since you brought it up is this delicate interplay between us as consumers, people interested in it, people who use entheogenic plants for exploration, psychological work, psychospiritual work, whatever. The relationship between us, industry, and the planet itself in this weird sort of tripartite negotiation that's going on now. And on one hand, I want to believe that these things can't really be commodified in the way that they're seeking to commodify them, because they just don't have the pieces that one would need to make them something that you've talked at length about how they're anti-addictive, if anything, how they're really not something that you can just habitually use day in and day out. Then again, you can
Right.
microdose. Then again, they are companies are undergoing this ill-conceived notion, I think, of trying to create a psychedelic that's not psychedelic, that doesn't have a a psychedelic component to it,
Yeah.
a quote unquote tripping component to it, which I think is such a strange idea. But I want to
Right.
believe that the more these things mainstream, the more we're going to see that they can't really be commodified in the way that a lot of companies think they can be, at least not in their not in their traditional, the way that
Yeah.
they've emerged. um so
Yeah.
given that, what do you think the ideal way would be? If you suddenly were appointed the head of the way that this would roll out to the masses, or to anybody who wants to have the experience, what kind of a container would you like to see?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, everything you've said, I resonate totally with. I think that the folks that are trying to commodify this and turn it into just another product are completely misunderstand what this about is about. The and an excellent example of that is this idea that you can design psychedelics that are not psychedelic. I mean, by definition,
Right.
it has to have the effect. You can make a drug that may affect some of the receptors and so on that psychedelics affect without having an actual experience. My prediction is those drugs will not be effective. They'll be no more effective than the drugs we have, the SSRIs and so on. I mean, they're band-aids. They don't really let people get to the root of the problem. So,
Right.
and this is a misguided understanding that, well, if we can design a psychedelic that doesn't really have an experience, a lot more people will be taking it because, we can sell that because people won't be afraid to take it. A certain amount of fear and respect is exactly what
Yes.
people need when they
Yes.
approach the psychedelic experience. Not fear, but respect,
Yes.
and if they take it without respect, it's like I can take it in the morning and continue on my day without any need for reflection or integration of the experience. That's completely misunderstanding what it's all about, and the idea that you can't sell these things as drugs, as substances. The substances themselves are mostly in the public domain. and they're not worth that much, as commodities. What you can sell is the services, the
Mhm.
therapeutic services. So then you can create a context around that and sell therapies, in which psychedelics are part of the therapy. That's okay. I think that's all right, but it leads to a very strong tendency to medicalize or clinicalize
Yeah.
the psychedelic. So you create this thing that only rich people can afford.
Hmm.
They
Hmm.
can go to a clinic and pay, $10,000 for psychedelic therapy. The people that really can probably benefit the most, that's not accessible to them. So
Yeah.
what's fair about that? And I think in the cannabis industry, we've seen the same thing. When cannabis came on and was legalized, it was like, wow, we can sell all this weed. Well, now the market is saturated. Cannabis is not worth so much. You can't make money producing it, because it's so easy to produce. And so, there are those downsides to this. Sorry, I'm off on a tangent. I do tend to
No, by all
rave, as you
means.
might have noticed. But to your question, what I would like to see is, the other sort of elephant in the room here is how do we acknowledge and respect and empower the indigenous people who have
Yes.
been the stewards of this knowledge and the stewards of this genetics for thousands of years. And historically, it's always been that those people get pushed aside. You know, I mean, we can look at our food plants and a great many of our medicinal plants that are not psychedelics. They come out of these indigenous cultures. We come over, since the Columbian Exchange about 500 years ago. Europeans came to the New World. And while they were busy slaughtering most of these people, they were also stealing their food and medicinal plants, taking them back to Europe and commodifying them. Thank you very much for your coffee, your coca, your quinine,
Right.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Actually, coffee is an exception because coffee is European. But you get what I mean, this whole notion of biopiracy. Now, sort of, you're getting the same thing happening with psychedelics. It's like, you indigenous people, you guarded this knowledge and these plants for so long, and now we'll take it from here, and you can go back and live you know in your poverty, in your degraded communities after we've wrecked your culture. uh, this is not good. We have a lot to make up for.
Yes.
What I would like to see, and I'm not sure it's possible, but I would like to see us pause a minute and think about how we should deliver these medicines, these indigenous medicines, to our culture. How do we bring them into our culture in a way that reflects their origins and their roots and their
Yes.
cultural roots? In my lectures and talks, I sometimes say, we should bring the medicines to the people, not the people to the medicines. And by that, I mean, for example, uh, the burgeoning of the explosion of things like ayahuasca tourism,
Yeah.
uh, which I participated in. I mean, I'm one of the
Same.
guilty ones because
Yeah.
I've
Same.
organized retreats and I've done that. But I've come to think of it as maybe not the right approach,
Hmm.
And what I would like to see as these things become legalized, or at least not criminalized in North America, Europe, all over you know the so-called advanced societies, or global societies, uh, is the establishment of centers where you could essentially, they could be alternative health care centers. They could
Mhm.
be places where people could come for a spectrum of healing modalities that would include psychedelics, work with indigenous people to produce those medicines and bring those medicines to the north, along with the people that know how to use them, which are basically the shamans. Not that we can't have psychotherapy as part of this, but that's not the whole story. Form effectively a collaboration, a global collaboration, so that every community could have like a healing center, and a lot of them already exist, but they're underground. But if they could come out of the shadows and work with indigenous people to produce the medicines, like grow ayahuasca and that sort of thing in sustainable ways, bring them into these uh, places where they can be used, and then have it be very much community based.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the retreat model is good. It's kind of like, but not necessarily retreats where you have to go to South America or other places, and because that can be beneficial to those cultures in some ways, but very harmful to them in other ways.
Mm.
I mean, it
Interesting.
can be beneficial, it can bring some economic benefits, but usually there's disparities. I mean, the curanderos become superstars, they make
Mm.
lots of money,
Yeah.
everybody else continues in poverty. There's pressure on the sources, on the ayahuasca and iboga, and these plants are
Yeah.
essentially endangered species.
Yeah.
Now because of overharvesting, they can
Right.
be sustainably produced, but they're not. I mean, there are efforts made to do this. So these alliances between indigenous communities and communities in North America, uh, or Europe or wherever, this could be a way to go.
Yeah.
This could be the way out of this, and it's based on it's it's not necessarily a purely capitalist approach. You have to generate enough revenues and so on as to make it sustainable. But
Yeah.
personally, I think this is the way to do it.
Yeah.
This is one
I
way to do it.
I agree. I agree. And now we're rubbing up against something that I've really been grappling with personally in the last couple of years, which is the importance of maintaining some level of ritualistic element to these
Yes,
experiences, while at the same time not necessarily trying to shoehorn ourselves into the indigenous container, because one of the difficult things is we are we are so out of context in the Western world in every way you can conceive of
right,
psycho-spiritually. Like
right.
spirituality, if anything, it's been relegated to a little hobby or afterthought. And we don't have any kind of agreed upon ontological ground or spiritual concept other than maybe a foggy, nebulous notion like God. Whereas these indigenous cultures are obviously coming out of this rich, largely unbroken animistic way of seeing the world where they have no problem thinking that I'm going to take this plant and I'm going to enter into the spirit realm or the whatever culture, the underworld or whatever it is, and I'm going to become aware of these extra intelligences. I'm going to merge my consciousness with this plant's consciousness, and we just don't. And even if we interact with these ideas, they're like concepts to us. We don't, even if we want to take
Hmm.
them literally, it's not like being raised in that way of seeing. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that ritual is an often overlooked component of these experiences. And it's actually
Yeah.
been quite a while for me since I've had a really deep experience, a really deep psychedelic experience to be specific. But as I've gotten more, I've been doing a real deep dive into Hellenistic culture, and I've been hugely fascinated by like Greek mystery traditions, and of course the notion that there may be a psychedelic ritual at the core of those initiations. But I've noticed that academics are very reluctant to want to explore this psychedelic angle to these mystery traditions, and I'm starting to
For
understand.
obvious reasons, right?
Yeah, yeah, and but even personally, as someone who I guess you could, I'm obviously a pro psychedelic person, you could say, but I think I myself have been guilty of this, where it's like, yeah, we're really just putting all this pomp and circumstance and layers in front of the experience. But I'm changing my mind on that. I've really changed my mind on that, in that those things orient you. Those things
Hmm.
give you those very concepts that we're missing, that we like, this symbolic language that we've lost touch of. And I don't know if the answer is to rebuild that, is to look at something like maybe more of a Jungian template that respects those things but thinks of them more as archetypes that span across cultures. If it is
Yeah,
to have some kind of archaic revival where we embrace the more shamanistic, animistic way of seeing, what
exactly.
is the answer for you?
Well, I think that you touch on some very interesting, things that need to be thought through. And I think the ritualistic element in these experiences is very important. I often say about psychedelics, about ayahuasca, for example. Ayahuasca is a liquid. It
Yeah.
will fill whatever vessel you create for it.
Mm.
So we have to be thoughtful about the vessels that we create. I don't think that we're not indigenous people. I don't think that we can attempt to become indigenous people, but we can look at those traditions and we can learn from them. We can incorporate elements with their help to develop a neo-shamanic technology for the use of these substances within the context of our culture, post 20th century, 21st century, globally wired people that we are, but we can develop models. We can't just co-opt them and essentially appropriate them because they won't work for us, but we can learn from them and we can develop our own ritualistic context that may borrow from elements of that and maybe have elements that we bring to the table, that were not available. And I don't know what that might be, maybe VR and things like that.
Mm.
uh, so that we develop a post 21st century shamanic uh, technology for utilizing these things that's appropriate for our culture, that's respectful of the indigenous origins and so on, but that really doesn't is not a sort of you know uh, kind of pathetic attempt to imitate these things. I mean,
Yeah.
we've seen the same thing happen in the movement to Eastern religions, which is now years in the past, but much of it was the same.
Yeah.
People would go to India, they'd go to ashrams, they'd study with a guru and whatever, and then they'd come back and try to implement that, try to imitate that. It doesn't work to implement it or imitate it. We have to develop something that really is appropriate for our own culture, but it can be just as beautiful, just as spiritual, and
Yeah.
just as genuine as the indigenous traditions.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think we would want to actually be open to having indigenous people help us with this, mentor us essentially. Many of them are. One of the interesting things about interaction with indigenous communities on this thing, there's a concern that people say, well, they won't want to share their secrets, they won't want to tell us what they really know. actually they're happy to share what they know. They want to share
Mhm.
what they know. They just want to be respected for it,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And I think we can do that. So that I think if psychedelic therapy, therapeutic psychedelic medicine in the 21st century is to survive, the methodologies and procedures that are developed around psychedelic uh, therapies are going to look a lot like shamanism,
Hmm.
or a lot like some hybrid between shamanism and psychotherapy. You
Yeah. I
know,
like that.
take the best of both, create something that is effective, that is you know that works, and that
Yeah.
actually respects them. And it's such a tricky thing that psychedelics are like any powerful spiritual technology, uh, and we know from the history of religions and cults and this sort of thing, it's important that the people who are doing this, administering these kinds of therapies, developing this, have an actual ethical compass.
Oh, yes.
Uh, I mean, there are all sorts of tales of, uh, people who are basically sociopaths. They're after power, money, sex, whatever it is, create cults. Cults are kind of an example of a spiritual community in which it's gone off the rails,
Of course. Yeah.
and it's not about spiritual self discovery or evolution. It usually is about, uh, you know, well, like religion in general. I mean, we
Yeah.
could get off onto that
It
tangent,
makes
but
a
it's about people
fantastic
who
it
want
makes a
answers.
fantastic
They
way
just
to
want to
inflate your
hand it
ego. Yeah.
handed to them. And I think what psychedelics invite us to do, if we're up to it, if we're willing to accept the challenge, they invite us to think for ourselves,
Yes.
you know.
Yeah.
And religion is not about that. Religion is about, we have a set of truths, and if you will only believe those, you'll be happy
Yeah.
and saved, right? That's been the shell game and the propaganda of religion since forever.
Yeah.
And I think we need to evolve beyond that.
Yes. That is for sure. That is for sure. And I'm with you. I mean, once you have an impactful, significant experience of your own, it makes it very difficult not to start going kind of reject the exoteric path and start to embrace the
Yeah,
more esoteric path and mystical path. And by that I mean a path that really only prizes direct experience and really starts to raise an eyebrow toward monolithic control systems and dogma and just unquestioned obedience. It really the two really don't go hand in hand, though it seems like some people have successfully used them for sort of mind control brainwashing purposes as well. So you never know, I
very
guess.
much so.
It's a mixed bag, but
I
I
mean, the
wonder
last
what
thing religions want you to have is an actual mystical experience.
agreed. Yes.
They've placed all sorts of obstacles in
and
that, and it's
and
like, that's heresy. the
yeah.
the priests are the ones that get to have the mystical experience, and of course they don't either. So the whole thing becomes kind of hollowed out, and
Right.
it becomes essentially a tool for mind control, a tool for bludgeoning people into a set of beliefs, because it's easier to accept these beliefs and turn off your mind and stop thinking about
Hmm.
stuff.
Yeah.
That's been my criticism of religion for a long, well, since I started to ask questions about, my own Catholic upbringing at the age of 12. And it's like you step back from it and you say, wait a minute, this is bullshit.
Yeah. There is an interesting there isn't I agree, but there also is kind of an interesting counterpoint that goes with what we were saying before about ritual, in that if you go back into antiquity, and this may apply to shamanistic cultures as well, though my knowledge there isn't as quite as deep, but there was a route by which knowledge was administered and, experienced. And
Yeah,
these more initiatory ways of knowing in the Gnostic sense, you couldn't just cut straight to the truth. You couldn't just skip steps. You did need to go through certain levels of education, followed by an initiation. Then, when it seemed like you were ready for the next one, you got the next one. And if we make a somewhat somewhat dubious speculation, but probably reasonable speculation, that many of these initiations probably did include a mind altering component.
yeah,
There might be some wisdom there too, in a sort of don't put pearls before swine kind of way of, you don't just get to cut right to the firework experience. You need to
right,
contextualize
right.
yourself. And do you think there's a route like that
Yeah,
that could be
absolutely. I
reintroduced?
mean, absolutely. I think that's exactly what needs to happen. I mean, when I said you need to, that the experience requires a vessel, it requires a
Hmm, hmm.
ritual context, but it's more than just what happens when you're in the experience. It is the preparation, the reflection on it, and then the experience, and then the integration of what you've learned. So it's an educational process. Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. And that's the right way to do it. I'm encouraged in some ways, and in other ways I'm dismayed, but I'm encouraged in some ways that I've been reading various articles these days lately about uh, religious leaders, members of churches, and so on, Christian churches who are using psychedelics. They've discovered
Yeah.
psychedelics and they want to bring that to their congregation. And I think this impulse is, to be lauded, to be encouraged, because if ever there was a religion that was that was sort of hollowed out and made devoid of true mystery, for centuries, it's Christianity. Christianity, a true Christian revival would be to rediscover uh, this mystery,
Yeah.
and bring it to people, bring truly meaningful experiences to people. Of course, the problem with Christianity or any religion is it carries all this other baggage with it of dogma and so on. Need to you know, de-emphasize that or even get rid of it completely, although I don't see that happening. But why are people attracted to religious practices? They're attracted because they're looking for meaning, right? And they're looking for something that's meaningful in their lives. You know, the experience of some dude who died 2,000 years ago who it's claimed is resurrected, doubtful. I mean, you can learn from it, but the religion doesn't need to be centered on that. I think that a truly spiritual tradition should be centered on a person's experience, their relationships with other people in their communities, their families, and so on. That's where we find meaning. That's where these centers that I'm talking about, they could be the focus for this kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
call them religious if you want, but they don't even have to be overtly, you know, uh, out of some religious tradition. They can be secular easily and deliver the same kind of spiritual gifts, I guess you could say, as those that come out of religious traditions, even more so because they don't have all this baggage, all the other stuff you have to buy into to be a good Catholic or a good Protestant or a good Jew or whatever it is. You know, less emphasis on uh, less emphasis on dogma and acceptance of dogma and doctrine, more emphasis on what's meaningful about the
Yeah.
religion.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's
No, for sure. For sure. And I mean, something has to change because we've all seen the enormous shedding of people who associate with religions. And clearly that means something needs to change, that there needs to be some kind of revolution in the way that we express our natural spiritual impulse. And I do think that I don't think we can ignore psychedelics in that equation. And by the way, it's so easy to beat up on religion, but to your point too, I've also been heartened by some of the stuff I've heard. I don't remember who it is, but I think it was Michael Pollan was talking about him at the MAPS conference during his keynote, and he quoted whoever this guy is. I can't think of his name, unfortunately. He is a pastor, and he said
yeah,
psychedelics have a lot to teach religion, and religion has a lot to teach psychedelics. And I actually agree with that in the way that we're talking about, in that when you divorce these things from ritual, yes, they're powerful, but they're powerful in the way like an electric current is powerful. Like
right,
if you conditioned the electric current in a very specific way, it can do all kinds of things that you wouldn't even believe until you're able to capture that technology and become like an electrical engineer or something. Um, but
right.
one of the things I want to ask you is, we've been talking around the experience this whole time, and lenses and reality tunnels and the shamanistic way of seeing versus the psychological way of seeing. Is there a lens that you not, I don't want to use the B word. I don't want to say believe in, or has captivated you, or has con- convinced you or drawn you in, but when you enter into these spaces, where what is your interpretive lens of choice? Are you right there with the curandero, believing like I'm entering the spirit realm, I'm going into the great mystery of being? Are you looking at it in a more psychological way, a more Jungian way, some mixture of all of the above? you know living
Yeah,
thought form aliens. What is your
not
interpretive?
so
Yeah.
much. I
Mm.
mean, I'm looking at it as a yeah. I don't when I am in a traditional ayahuasca ceremony and I, are participating in that. I sort of this question also comes up with the discussions going on a lot now about the DMT
Yeah.
entities or the
Yeah.
other entities that you encounter in these spaces. Uh, maybe it's my scientific background, but I tend toward reductionism, and I tend toward thinking, yes, you have these experiences, you do encounter these entities. I think it originates in our mind. I mean, it comes from the unconscious. I do not, they're like dreams. I don't see any evidence that these entity encounters are actual intelligences separate from us, off in some extra dimension someplace. I mean, I used to think that,
Hmm.
but my thinking has changed over time, and I think that's it. And then with respect to this, I can go to an ayahuasca ceremony and enjoy the ritual and enjoy, the experience and, whatever entities that might be experienced and so on. But I just assume that this is my mind. This is like being immersed in a video game, kind of.
Hmm.
Not that that devalues it. I mean, you have to think people will, you have to remember effectively everything we experience, is real. Whatever we experience is real, in the sense that we can experience it, and so if we experience entities, yes, they're real. You had that experience. But what do we mean by real? That's the nub of it. Is
Yeah.
it an idea? Is it something separate from us? And you get into some pretty tricky sort of epistemological spaces. What do
Yes,
we
you do.
mean by real? What do we mean by separate? Everything originates in our conscious experience. We live in a hallucination. that our brains manufacture. We call it reality. It's actually a model of reality,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we
So
can tweak it in different ways. We can tweak it with psychedelics, but we're still in that model of reality.
yeah.
We're just looking at some of the outer fringes of it, perhaps.
Yeah.
So,
I've talked to Gallimore about this too, and like the way that
yeah,
the brain builds the model of reality and the way psychedelics perturb that model of reality, yet at the same time instantly render this completely alien hyper geometrical platonic hyperspace world filled with entities. And it's just it's such, regardless of how you try to skin the cat, it's an incredible mystery. Like if you're trying to explain it purely through neurochemistry and the brain, the convenient brain hallucination sort of epiphenomenal hypothesis, or it's somehow like a chemical gateway to another realm, or you're gaining extra sensory capacities for the amount of time that you're under the influence. Like whatever it is, it's so incredibly strange and compelling and alien. But I do want to ask you,
yeah.
because I've heard you use words like spirit, I've heard you use words like collective consciousness. So does does that interpretation of the experience you were just describing, where it is dreamlike, it is somewhat an invention of your own mind, do those two views dovetail together, or is this something you kind of oscillate on?
I'm oscillating. I mean, I'm oscillating. There are elements of both. I'd be the last person to say I have this figured out, and I think nobody has it figured out. I am encouraged, or a little bit surprised and encouraged that somebody like Andy Gallimore, who's spent so much time thinking about this and writing about it,
Yeah.
even he says at the end of the day, he says, I don't know where it's coming from. And that's extremely intellectually honest in my mind for him to say that. He's not coming down on that, yes, this is some other hyper dimension that we're penetrating to, because if you really look at that assertion, well, then again you come up against these questions. It's very easy to throw these words around like other dimensions.
Yeah, right.
What is another dimension? It means certain things to mathematics and certain things to cosmologists, and so it's a loose use of terms, you know and uh, and so it becomes difficult. But I oscillate. I mean, so far the thing is, I kind of believe in the principle of parsimony,
Mm.
the notion that the simplest explanation that accounts for all the data is probably the one that we should stick with until new data comes along that demolishes, or forces us to change that perspective. So
Hmm.
far, I haven't seen any evidence that does not that disproves that this all comes out of your mind and your imagination.
One of
But
the
that's
things,
not a devaluation of it. The
yes,
human imagination is where everything originates,
right.
all of our experience, and it's important. It's just that it's not from somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah, and the question is so hard because it's like, what is the simple explanation? Is neurochemistry a simpler explanation than us being tapped in to, or just being in an ecosystem that we're often blind to? It's like, and then you run into a lot of these big epistemological and even ontological questions, like the hard problem of consciousness and what is
Right.
consciousness? Is it epiphenomenal? Are we like some kind of meat radio receiving a signal from a higher dimension? There's so many different ways to look at it. But one of the things in going down this particularly path of Greek wisdom and how that's transmitted into modern day, that I've really been romanced by personally, is Platonism and Neoplatonism. And particularly in the way that if you take some of these core hypostases proposed you know, essentially that we're living in a universe that is oddly ordered, is oddly intelligible, is oddly imbued with just the right laws of physics and fine tuning mechanisms for everything to exist. Parsimony starts to change from what I think most people intuitively think, because there's nothing really obvious or intuitive about the fact that we exist at all. Like it seems like from all the available information, it seems like a miracle on the order of, you know, uh something like a hurricane producing a fully built house or something. And
Right.
I've talked to, you know, a lot of different people from who look at this from a cosmological angle or a consciousness angle, and they all have different questions, but it seems like the one or and different answers, but it seems like the one thing they all settle on is, yeah, it's pretty weird and spooky that an intelligible universe exists and that we're here at all, and that's worth paying attention to. And the reason
I
I
agree.
brought up Platonism is um Platonism explains it with, yeah, essentially a lower shadow of a higher realm that's ordered, and
Hmm.
we're experiencing the order of that higher realm, something like a realm of forms that's imbued with a certain kind of logic or logos. And once I started to learn that a lot of mainstream physicists and mathematicians, like Penrose, for instance, openly call themselves Platonists, I started to more openly be like, okay, if he's on board with some of these principles.
I'm kind of on that. I'm on that spectrum also. I mean, I
Mm,
think that the mind, the brain, is a transducer of both internal and external information. You know, information comes in through our sensory portals, but in a raw form, and our brain processes this and associates it with memories and other kind. There's a whole lot of internal massaging that happens before we extrude, if you will, this model of reality, this reality hallucination that we inhabit. I mean, this is the final cut, in a
yeah.
certain sense. This is the edited version. And
Yes.
I do think that I think that the brain, as you mentioned, is inherently intelligible. And we're an aspect of that. And I'm with Penrose and these people. I think I'm a panpsychist, basically. I think that, consciousness is probably built into reality at some fundamental level, and usually, I mean, the consciousness or the consciousness of an electron exists, but it's not like the consciousness of a complex nervous system. But
Yeah.
if you accumulate enough of that in in a small enough place, I mean, an analogy I used to talk about, and I think it's valuable, is uh, you know, if the concept of a black hole, for example, a singularity, if you stuff enough mass into a small enough area, then you get an event horizon forms and this thing implodes on itself and you have a singularity.
Yeah.
And the singularity is something about which you can say all things kinds of things about what's happening around it. You can say nothing about what's actually happening inside it,
Yeah.
because that's impossible. Maybe consciousness is kind of like a metaphysical singularity based
Mm,
on complexity. The brain is one of the most complex objects in our known universe, possibly the most complex. If you stuff enough complexity, enough higher level biological organization into a small enough space, then it becomes a kind of singularity of consciousness. I don't know if that concept has any value, but it's neat to think
yeah.
about. And all of these things are kind of that way. They're ideas that are very hard to prove, but certainly fun to play with and some fun
Yes,
to speculate about. Yeah,
they really are. And then when you know, like one of the things that always strikes me after a significant psychedelic experience is how special this particular consensus reality, quote unquote, hallucination or construct or whatever you want to call it, is. You know, it's like
yeah,
I always feel like I enter into that space, even if I'm I always approach with respect and fear. But I also, when I start to get there, I have this kind of oh shit moment where I start to remember, oh, this is what it really is. It wasn't
yeah,
my idea of what it is. Now I'm in what it really is. And it's
right,
always, you know, so difficult to, you know, it's just such a explosion of sensation and thought and alien and just everything that when you get there it's inevitably just not like what you remembered it being. And as miraculous as all of that is, I actually exit the experience feeling like this is more miraculous. And it's like that weird reshuffling of context where the mundane becomes magical all over again that we end up
right.
losing sight of. And in that same way, I think we end up doing the same, like me as like somebody who gropes for these more kind of mystical interpretations of consciousness like panpsychism or cosmopsychism or something. I think I'm guilty of missing out on the magic of that epiphenomenal interpretation because you know, of complexity just eventually giving rise to the human experience, like neuronal density eventually giving rise to the human experience. Because even if some level of consciousness is fundamental, there is still something very strange and mysterious and special about human consciousness that requires this hyper complex neuronally dense brain. And it's so fucking weird and like often
Well,
not
it's
appreciated by quote unquote spiritual people.
yeah. I mean, it's if it is related to complex organization, I mean, if you look at chemical processes, this comes up a lot in discussions of the origins of life. I mean, chemical processes go on in prebiotic or abiotic environments, but at a certain point, it crosses a threshold. And these things form membranes around themselves, and then they start replicating, and it's all still physics and chemistry, but this is a whole new order, ontological order. And I think a similar thing may be going on. This, increases in complexity will lead to emergent properties, I guess
Yeah.
is the most direct way to say it. Consciousness is an emergent property of consciousness as we experience is an emergent property of all this complexity being stuffed into, these 3 pound pieces of jelly that we call our brain. I
Yeah.
mean, they're
Yeah.
pretty remarkable when you think about it.
Yes,
So
that very remarkable. Very remarkable. And I do
we
think
we
that
could
that
we could go after this all day,
yeah, for
but
sure. For
but
sure.
certainly interesting conceptual things to think about.
Yes, they are. Yeah, and I do think there are so many mysteries within the physical, neurological, and even electrical layer of what it is to be a human being. I don't know if you've ever heard about this guy, Michael Levin or Levin. He's a he's in, I forget what university he's a part of, but he's a professor who looks a lot at this bioelectrical layer of intelligence that emerges in the body. And they've learned that just through manipulating that layer, you can change all kinds of crazy natural processes. Like they've done things like move eyeballs around on like toads or flatworms. They've done all kinds of things that you're not even interfering with its genetics. You can somehow interfere with this electrical layer and change the way life organizes itself. And then what's remarkable is even
Yeah,
if you intervene in that process, there's a weird self-correction that occurs that they don't understand. It's like you can muck around with it, and then some kind of self-organizing intelligence puts everything back where it's supposed to be. it's
right,
it's so
right.
strange and
So it's
interesting.
something like the morphogenetic field idea that
Yeah.
there's some kind of a bioelectrical field that maintains the organization of the system, so that, yeah, the eyes are in your head normally, and other parts are where they're supposed to be, but you can change all that,
Yeah.
at least
Yeah.
in amphibians and roundworms and things like that. Yeah, in us it's probably more difficult. This is very,
And a lot more
sort of
unethical. A lot more unethical.
Frankensteinian
Yeah.
approach to all
Yeah.
this, but more power to him. I mean, I think that's all very fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're
This
starting
idea
to.
of the holographic organization of the brain. Back in the day when Terence and I were writing our first book, The Invisible Landscape,
Mhm.
there was an article that came out called Shuffle Brain, and it was a neurophysiologist basically working with, I think, planaria and things like that, or maybe it was a slightly more evolved organism, but he was dissecting the brain. He would move the parts around, and he would, put it all back together, and it still functioned perfectly, and this was a argument for the holographic nature of the brain, the idea
Mm,
that the smallest part reflected the functions of the whole, and so on.
interesting.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think I have to go,
Oh, okay.
but have we pretty much covered a lot of territory here.
I could keep talking to you, but I know you're a busy man. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. Um, yeah, and if there's anything else, I know you're doing great work with your foundation. I'll make sure I tell people all about that.
Well,
Or
you
if
can
if
tell
there's,
people
yeah,
about the McKenna Academy. It's
yeah, Academy, sorry.
mckenna.academy, and direct them to our website. It's not nearly as stimulating as the conversation we've been having, but there's some really good stuff out there, mostly related to ethnobotany and ethnopharmacology and that sort of stuff. But it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I hope we can do it again. We've started a podcast for the Academy,
Oh, lovely.
so it's called the Brain Forest Cafe, and people can see that off our website and other places, and maybe we can revisit it, and you can be on my podcast
I would love that.
sometime.
I would love that. You host it?
I'd love to do that.
You host your own podcast? I didn't even know
I
that.
am the host. Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, Dennis. Well, much love to you, my friend. Thank you so much for everything you've done over the years. And yes, of course, would love to riff with you again.
Thank you so much, Michael.